Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. There's a wonderful new book about New York history. It's called An Unlikely Union, the love-hate story of New York's Irish and Italians. The author, Paul Moses, a professor of journalism at Brooklyn College, proves that history could be much more interesting than fiction as he recounts the disdain and rivalry between these two ethnic groups so important to this city. He's my guest today. Welcome.
Good to be with you, Ronnie.
I love the book. You can't, you get caught up in it, and you can't wait to see the rest of it. And it's really terrific.
Thank you.
So you were an Italian, and
I'm
you
half
married
Italian.
half Italian, and you married an Irish woman.
That's right.
She's totally Irish.
Yeah, her ancestry. she's grown up here in New York,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's really where the idea
Came from.
I was just reflecting one day. We get along pretty well. But I knew that in the past, for somebody who was Italian to marry someone Irish would have been caused some controversy in their families, and so I just became interested. Well, how did we get to the place we are now from that place we were back in the past, where there was a lot of rivalry about the two? So I began to
Really?
research it, and found out the rivalry was actually much deeper than I thought from stories I'd heard growing up.
I just want to digress for 1 minute, because you said that you had two grandparents who were Jewish.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So, and that's on your father's side?
Yes. Yeah. From Germany.
From Germany. So what happened when the German Jew married the Italian woman?
I mean, one thing that happened before that is that my father actually converted to Catholicism of his own, not connected to the marriage.
That's interesting.
But they were a family they were refugees from Hitler. They came in 1938. And so I haven't seen any kind of stress in my family over that at all. Certainly my mother's family very much welcomed my father and his family.
Yeah. That's so interesting. When you said you had two grandparents, I thought, well, what happened to them?
Two Italian grandparents, two German Jewish grandparents, very different from each other.
Yeah, that's so great. So that's a wonderful story. Your children are Italian?
Well, they're Catholic.
Or are they Irish? I forgot the mother was.
They would be 1/4 Italian.
Right.
And half Irish, and 1/4 the German Jewish, my children, yes.
And do they understand all this when you wrote this book? Were they surprised at the background?
I think they're reading it now, so they'll find out some of the family history in it.
Yeah. The book starts actually with Garibaldi, who every child in school remembers as a hero. He came to this country as a refugee, basically, or maybe to rest. I don't know if he planned to stay here, did he?
No, he was ready to go back, but
he had to leave.
He had kind of a down point in his life where, after some initial successes in his campaign in Italy, he had to flee, and on the way his wife died. So he eventually takes refuge here in New York. Actually lives in Staten Island for a year or two. But the interesting thing about him in the book is that the Irish Catholics in New York wanted no part of Garibaldi.
He came here because, let's say what happened in Italy.
Right. In Italy, he'd been defeated.
He tried to, what did he try to liberate Rome? Or?
The Italian nationalists actually at a certain point succeeded, but then lost it back to the Pope's allies, who were the Austrians and the French. So the Austrians, it's an incredible story. It would make a great movie. They just chased him, a long way. His wife was dying along the way. She dies. He manages to make these hairbreadth escapes, makes his way, ultimately comes to America, where Americans loved what he was doing because he was, striking out for freedom against these old world monarchs.
Yeah.
So he was very much, people wanted to give parades for him, but the Archbishop of New York, John Hughes, was dead set against anything that would honor Garibaldi or people like him, because Garibaldi had gone to war with the Pope, and the Irish identity was very tied up with loyalty to the Pope for good historical reasons.
At the time, though, there was hundreds of Italians in the city.
Yeah, only
not
a few.
Very many.
I think about 800 plus in New York.
Out of a couple 100,000 Irish, right?
Yeah,
or more than a couple hundred.
There were very few Italians. Some of them were prominent refugees, as Garibaldi was. It wasn't until about 1880 that Italians really arrived in very large numbers.
But when Garibaldi came, and the Archbishop took a stand, it then drove this separation and anger of the Irish against the Italians, and they even kept the Italians out of church, right?
Well,
or in the basement.
It becomes a factor in the way the Irish clergy viewed the Italians, and the Italians the way they viewed the clergy. So yeah, there's this division. I guess to sum it up, the Italians, deepest national aspirations meant that they had to go to war with the Pope to take the papal lands and Rome and unite Italy. The Irish deepest national aspirations were tied up in their faith, and it's what set them apart from the British, their occupiers for centuries. And part of that pride in their faith involved great loyalty to the Pope. So these two people who come from very different places in Europe, meeting here in New York, but they already have this division, and they're both Catholics, but they practice their religion in very different ways. They meet in the churches, they meet in the streets, they meet in the workplace, and there's just a lot of friction. So you would think offhand that their both being Catholic would tend to unite them, and it did eventually, but at first it actually gave them opportunity for conflict.
And they were also discriminated against because they were dark-skinned. They were, what were they, exotic or just undesirable?
As somebody who's half Italian, it was really humbling to read about how my ancestors were viewed in our city, and really as third-rate, suspected as criminals, scientific minds who thought that Italians were inferior, an inferior race. Morally unfit to be Americans, all that stuff was being said about the Italians. The Irish ran into some serious discrimination also, although by the time the Italians were coming, they had established a degree of power in New York. In 1880, we had the first Irish Catholic mayor elected, William R. Grace.
But the Irish, they never, did they actually... I guess they did. There was a conflict about work, too, right?
Right.
But, but the Irish had the advantage of being here before. They were always a step above.
They were, but there were still a lot of Irish men who were doing, menial work. They had managed to unionize on the waterfronts and the Knights of Labor and so forth, so they had a certain strength in that. Italians came in and were just willing to work for less and for longer days, and the businesses took full advantage of that.
And the businesses thought that they would always do the dirty work.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of clashing, and you see it just goes up the economic ladder. You read the old newspaper stories, and there's fights on the street between bootblacks, okay? The Italians are taking over that. And it goes into construction labor and into... and yes, the Irish are being bumped up. They become bricklayers and masons. But there's still a lot of conflict, to the point, I remember I found, there were so many fights, they were written about in the papers a lot. The Brooklyn Eagle editorialized about the different crews of Irish and Italian workers in Brooklyn. Can't they be separated, was the name of the editorial. They couldn't have them work within eyesight of each other. The
Herald Tribune came to the defense of the Archbishop earlier with the Garibaldi thing. Did the papers treat Garibaldi the way the Irish wanted them to treat him?
No, not at all. And no, Garibaldi was a hero to Americans other than the Irish Catholics. And
did that shock the Irish Catholics? It must have.
Well, they didn't like it.
Yeah.
They didn't like it.
Yeah.
And then there was a priest who came over, Father Gavazzi, who gave a series of celebrated lectures. And he was a renegade priest. He became a chaplain for Garibaldi, and gave these lectures that, all the papers were. It was the hottest thing in town in the mid-1850s. And he just outright insulted the Irish and told them that they were poor because of their religion. And he told them, if I went to Belfast and I saw, the Irish Protestants are doing very well, but if you have a cottage next to it that's a Catholic one, the people are really poor, and that's because their priests are keeping them enslaved. And so they were outright insulted by Father Gavazzi, who, by the way, is a hero of the Risorgimento. Yeah. His statue is on the Janiculum Hill in Rome, where all the other heroes of the revolution are.
So how did the Irish, what did they do in retribution or in resistance to him?
Well, in Ireland, they actually, the Cardinal Cullen, his name was, organized a brigade and sent them to Italy to fight in behalf of the Pope. and there was a pitched battle in Spoleto. I visited the spot. There's a monument to 15 Italians who died. It didn't say how many Irish died. But so there was actual warfare. And here in New York, people wanted to sign up and go over there to help fight for the Pope. And actually, the Irish Brigade, many of those soldiers fought in our American Civil War on both sides later on. But no, so there was that tension, and when the Italians do start coming in larger numbers to New York, it's there, that the Irish clergy felt the Italians were not good Catholics. They were banished to the basement of the churches, which also became a controversy that reached all the way to the Vatican. They didn't like it in Rome.
That what? That
the Italian immigrants were being banished down to to the basement of the churches. Yeah.
That's interesting that they had turned around more than the Irish, much more forgiving, right?
Well, I think, had some sense of identification because they were. The Pope wrote an encyclical saying they spring from the same race as ourselves, the same people as ourselves. In other words, I'm Italian, they're Italian, treat them better, is what the Pope was saying at the time. But later, of course, especially after World War II, the Church becomes an engine for bringing the Irish and the Italians together. They marry in the churches. They've met. They've gone to school together. The Irish nuns have trained the Italians. And so over time that does change. But
the politics, I mean, what was the next step? Was it was both looking for jobs, for work, and also for control, right?
Right. So
and the Irish were the first in the political sector.
Oh yeah, and
they owned the city.
They did, and even when the Lower East Side was almost all Italian and Jewish, the Irish ward leaders, people like Big Tim Sullivan, still retained control for a long time. Big Tim was very adept. He was the one who got Columbus Day made into a New York State holiday. And he had grown up very poor, and he knew what it was like, and he was able to, talk with the people and give them shoes and outings to the park and
he was known for giving the shoes, right?
Oh yeah, the shoes especially.
Not turkeys, just shoes.
Shoes, because as a boy he said that he had gone to his local ward leader and gotten a pair of shoes when he was really poor. His father had died when he was very young. So that was the story he told. But Big Tim was very good. But after Big Tim left, there were Italian politicians who were starting to say, "Well, wait a minute. I'd like to run for an office. I'd like to hold for an office. We've supported you." Tom Foley, for whom Foley Square is named. Now it's our turn. And there was a lot of violence around that. There were stabbings.
There was a connection, wasn't there, with gangsters and
Paul Vaccarelli, who
that was one of the greatest stories.
He changed his name to Paul Kelly.
Yeah, right. It goes he's decided he's Italian, he wants to be Irish, and then he changed it back, right?
He changed it back. He led a gang. They fixed elections. They did all kinds of mayhem under Big Tim's protection, in full view of the newspapers, which were writing about this all the time. And then he gets slightly wounded, almost gets assassinated, and he kind of reinvents himself as a labor leader. He heads a local of Italians who worked on garbage scows, but parlays that into being a vice president in the Longshoremen's Union, and to darn near taking the whole thing over.
And that was an interesting struggle.
Yes.
But he did that as Vaccarelli.
Yes, he changes his name
instead of being Irish. But the leadership of the IL, was it the ILA then, or
yes,
similar? That was Irish.
Yes.
So I wondered why he decided to be Italian instead of Irish to run against the Irish.
He said his parents were always unhappy with him for changing his name to Kelly. That's what he said.
This is a gangster we have to talk about, right?
Right.
And he's worried about what his parents think.
He's an interesting guy. He was pretty suave. He spoke multiple languages. He was very tough. He had been a boxer when he was young.
How did he learn the languages?
I don't even know. Maybe he picked him up on the street. I don't know. But he was quite the character. I think it served him now that he was head of an Italian local to have the Italian name. So he changed it back. He spearheads what was the largest waterfront strike in American history in 1919. And what he does is the Irish...
That was so funny. Go on.
The Irish leadership of the ILA is kind of pro-management, I think. T.V. O'Connor, his name was. Just wanted to keep things quiet. But there's tremendous agitation after World War I because, there were no raises during the war. So Paul Vaccarelli Kelly organizes the Italian workers and brings them into Manhattan where all the workers were Irish in Chelsea. And gets the Irish workers who hated the Italian workers to work together and walk out. And so there's this giant strike. And then, to top it all off, President Wilson names Paul Vaccarelli to the 3-person mediation panel, which really annoys the ILA leadership because they remember that he was a gangster. Now he's got a presidential appointment. and so... Vaccarelli looks like a statesman. Even during the war, he received thanks from the federal government for keeping peace on the docks.
So when was it? Was it the First World War that the rumor was that the Irish were supporting the Germans?
Right. There may have even been a bit of a plot somewhere by the Germans
at the time of the strike
to try to stir up dissension on the docks, to stir up a strike.
Yeah.
And Paul Vaccarelli, and he had this Irish sidekick who was quite the character named Dick Butler, and they ran to the newspapers with the story and became heroes for helping. There were lots of thank yous to Vaccarelli, who only a few years before had been this feared gangster.
So, but they're relating the Irish Catholics with Ireland. And Ireland with the Germans.
That's it. Yeah, the Germans thought that they could manipulate the Irish because of their feelings toward the British. Yeah,
it's so incredible.
And a lot's happening. 1916 is the Easter Rising in Dublin.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of very strong national feelings that carry over here to New York. Yeah.
So the connection between Tammany Hall, the Irish, and the criminal justice system, judges.
Yeah.
And also then to the police department.
Right.
It's a very complicated history there, yeah?
It's basically an Irish institution. There's a wonderful book by a former police commissioner, McAdoo, his name was, who wrote this book in 1906, Guarding a Great City. And he was Irish. He was born in Donegal. And he talks a lot about the Irish influence in the NYPD and how even those who are not Irish, like maybe some German American cops, kind of adopted the Irish ways. And so, yeah, it's a very Irish institution. Tammany also was Irish-led and nominated Irish candidates for mayor, year after year after year. And at a certain point, the Italians and the Jews wanted to break into that. They had the numbers. There were vast numbers. And it was a little difficult to do that. LaGuardia was really the one who managed to do it. It took that, and he eventually, first time out, he lost to Jimmy Walker, which was a fun story to tell because Jimmy Walker was so colorful
and so Irish,
that kind of good-natured, clever, funny, charming, very emblematic of the Irish. This is a great essay by Peter Quinn, Looking for Jimmy, where he talks about that. Yeah.
So I'll come back to Tammany, but they also were very strong. Tammany also controlled the judges.
Yeah. Although some of the judges would look and see, well, there was this brawl in the street between Irish and Italians. How come only Italians are being brought in? Italians would struggle. What do you think? To say. But so there were some judges who were Irish who tried to even the score on things, and others who didn't. But yeah, it was predominantly an Irish judicial system from the Italian point of view. Basically, the Irish were the gatekeepers in a lot of areas that the Italian immigrants had to go through. They had to pass through a lot of doors where there was somebody Irish standing. Your teacher. Your ward boss, you're a police officer, your judge, your lawyer. It took time for Italians to break into.
And a lot of the Catholics went to parochial schools.
Eventually, Italians did.
Yeah.
Yes. And some of the schools turned over very quickly. Once Italians went to them, the Irish wouldn't go to them anymore.
Oh, that's. And where the faculty were Italian Catholic?
No.
They're still Irish.
There were some places, Mother Cabrini came and her nuns taught,
yeah.
so there were some Italian teachers. But I talk in the book about a Sister Monica McInerney who taught and was principal for many years at Old St. Pat's down on Princeton. and she actually taught my Aunt Josephine.
Oh,
and so I heard about her growing up. And I saw a reference to her in a historical book and just pursued that and told a bit of her story. But people like Sister Monica, I know she made a big impact on my Aunt Josephine because she talked about her all her life. And they, hibernicized some of these Italian children.
You told it's a charming story when the kids in the class wanted to know if the sister was Irish or Italian, and she wouldn't tell except that you said there was a clue that she would what?
Yeah, I tell a little bit of a few personal anecdotes in the book and work in bits of my own family story. So yes, when I was in 8th grade, Sister Andrew Marie, to punish us, she had this big plastic green shillelagh, and you have to put your hand out, and she would smack you with this thing.
So if you had thought about it, you would know it wouldn't. An Italian nun wouldn't have had that, right?
And so the kids, the class was almost all 60 kids, almost all of Irish or Italian background, and so as St. Patrick's Day would approach, everybody would be teasing back and forth. And, Sister, are you Irish or Italian? And wisely, she wouldn't say, but it was obvious. Yeah.
So LaGuardia was the first Italian to get elected, and Carmine DeSapio, the first Italian to become the county leader?
County leader, yes. And LaGuardia is a great character. It was fun to tell his story. He's perceived as having, slain the Tammany tiger. Actually, Tammany remained pretty important. They had a lot of,
right, never really went away.
A lot of other borough presidents and county leaders. It was
LaGuardia was really his personality, wasn't it? And maybe reformers, but around him were still not Italian politicians.
I mean, part of it was just the right time. He lost in 1929, but then after the Depression and after the scandals that hit Jimmy Walker and his administration, he came back and won in the next time around, and 2 more times after that.
Yeah.
What was interesting to me was in his last victory, he went against Bill O'Dwyer, and O'Dwyer won the Italian vote in that election. And O'Dwyer, was born in Ireland.
Yeah.
And to think that a majority of Italians in 41 were able to vote for an Irish-born candidate, it shows that things are changing.
That was the beginning of the transition.
Yeah, things
So
are
then
changing.
how did it finally come together?
Well,
And has it really come together?
I would say it has. I think
right.
if you find people with a long memory, they'll still. Most of the differences between Irish and Italians now, it's joke. People joke about it. They tease. It's not the passion and anger that you see earlier on. I think there's a few things that bring them together. First, the Italians are advancing economically, so now they're on this. They're equals. So that makes a difference. People are moving out of the old ethnic neighborhoods and into the suburbs, into new residential neighborhoods. Even the subway is dispersing people around the city. So they resettle and they mingle as neighbors. They get to know each other. I mean, it's really as simple as that. They're mingling in the workplaces. The Catholic Church and its school system are also kind of working on things. And in the end, they intermarry on a large scale. And what's interesting is the sociological studies show that the Italians who do marry Irish partners are almost always the ones who have gone to Catholic schools and are practicing Catholics. So that's really the glue.
It's the common thing.
Yeah.
So do you have lessons from this? I mean, can we ever hope that groups that are antithetical to each other will ever get together?
Yeah, I think that's the hope. That's the hope that I have, and there's some scholars, Richard Alba, for example, here in CUNY, who's looked at this question of what did it take to bring these groups together, and how can it happen. It helps if there are good economic times, so people are not, because a lot of our ethnic and religious tensions, there's an economic underlay to it.
Yeah.
And so if it's good times, that helps. It also helps when a group gets recognized through its own heroes, you know, a Jackie Robinson or LaGuardia or Frank Sinatra or Joe DiMaggio.
So you have a long, yes,
Yeah.
we even talk about them. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, we're almost at the end of this
Yeah.
program and there's so much more to talk about. But you really, and the intermarriage you think is also?
I think it brings
Part of it?
people together.
Yeah.
It can be a sensitive topic
Yeah.
for some groups, but it
Do
does.
the statistics, census figures and everything show there is more intermarriage, not only between Italians and Catholic and Irish, but with all kinds of groups.
Right, we're seeing it with Latinos and
Yeah.
Asians,
Yeah.
and to some degree with African Americans. And you know, with African Americans, there's just deep historical problems and divisions there. But can we at least hope?
Well,
I think so.
Yeah.
But it's difficult.
that's what's the lovely thing about this book. It's got wonderful stories in it, but it's cheerful. We didn't even talk about the importance of food, for instance.
Right, right.
With the Irish being known for not good food, and the Italians for all those luscious things. You think that's why some Irishmen married Italian women?
I say in a few cases that might be so. Yeah, I can even think of. Well, I'm just kidding, but yeah, I think so. Yeah, I get into the family life because that's an interesting area to me.
Right.
Now that people from different ethnic groups or racial groups do marry each other, well, you know, how does that play out in family life? And family therapists have actually done some interesting research on that.
I think it's
I work on that, yeah.
So we're at the end of this program. I hope people will really read this book because it is a delightful book and it's so informative about parts of the city's history. And congratulations.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Paul. If there are any people you'd like to hear or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I'd look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.